Hello, my name is Ewan McGahey, and today in Enterprise Law we are doing natural resources, which most people would typically think refers to the law of oil and gas, coal, things that you mine out of the ground. But today it's taking on a new meaning to be the sun, the wind, a stable climate, because if we really want a living planet, we have to shift decisively from fossil fuels to new renewable energies. So the quotes that I'd like to start with today are, firstly, "Let there be light," the phrase from God in the book of Genesis in the Old Testament. And this refers to the idea that God is creating the world, and he says there should be light. But it also has perhaps a double meaning, referring to the possibility that human beings might one day become enlightened. And the second idea I want to give you at the beginning is a quote from an author at Columbia University called Tim Mitchell, a professor of, I think, sociology there, in his book called Carbon Democracy, that the world's fossil fuels were formed out of 500 million years of buried sunshine. Literally, coal and oil and gas were originally plants, they were animals, they were sea life that had photosynthesized, absorbed sunlight, and then as they went into the ground and were compacted, they became the fossil fuels that we had today. And since the Industrial Revolution, Professor Mitchell points out that we have been releasing this incredible volume of energy, 500 million years of buried sunshine, all at once over the last 2 centuries. And the hope, perhaps, that we get from the book of Genesis is that human beings might be enlightened enough to know when too much light was too much, and that really we need to calm down a bit in burning fossil fuels. So what we're going to talk about today is the fact that human civilization has been powered by fossil fuels since the Industrial Revolution, but we now know very clearly that fossil fuels threaten life on Earth. So the key issues that we've got to cover are how fossil fuels are financed, and more importantly, how they can be defunded. Secondly, how regulators can re-govern the companies that operate selling fossil fuels and mining and extracting fossil fuels, re-govern them for clean energy. And thirdly, how a right to clean energy might work. So as usual, we're going to go through history and the finance of the enterprise, the governance of the enterprise, and look at a couple of specifically enforceable rights. Although in this field, unlike electricity that we're going to do next, there's much less to say, because really we're looking at a dying industry of gas and oil and coal, and what we want to do, ideally through the legal system, is accelerate that death as fast as we possibly can in order to protect life on Earth. So now, before we get into more of the nitty-gritty of history, we can see that over the course of human history, the technological change in terms of energy has been vast. So human beings first discovered fire, I think something like 300,000 years ago, and our main source of energy was burning wood in order to have heat and light in the evenings. And I'm oversimplifying a bit. We'll talk about it more next week in electricity, but there was also a lot of water power in early ancient civilizations. But the main thing that displaced wood as a source of energy was coal in the Industrial Revolution, particularly, but also around from the Middle Ages. Coal was already being widely used. The age of coal shifted to an age of oil and gas, particularly around the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century. Oil became certainly dominant, but now what we're looking at is the displacement of all these fossil fuels, but particularly oil, with solar panels, wind turbines, hydroelectricity, utility scale battery storage for energy, or pumped hydro storage. So we are shifting from fossil fuels to clean renewable energy. And these technological shifts are not just interesting for science, but they're also interesting for the way that human beings organize themselves, because different energy forms carry different kinds of power with them, depending on the environmental and economic fundamentals with how you get them and how you use them. So the age of coal was really the age of the British Empire. The steam engine was what powered the railways, the steamships that sailed around and conquered quite a lot of the planet. So, the technological advantage through coal is one of the things that sealed the British Empire's dominance over the 19th century. Oil really powered the America's rise and hegemony in the 20th century. So the empire state is really built on oil. And we can still see the remnants of oil as a basis for American power, albeit in rapid decline, for instance, through the disastrous war in Iraq or the current conflict going on in Venezuela. And the interesting thing about coal and oil is that they could be monopolized to an extent which renewable technology simply cannot. So as we shift away from oil and gas into a new era of renewable energy, whether renewable energy can be secured in any country on Earth, of course, in different places, the sun shines more and the wind blows more, but really it is accessible anywhere on Earth with abundant materials that can be used to construct the solar panels, the wind turbines. We're looking at a different kind of geopolitics, and I think that's really important to keep in mind as we go through this topic. So now more into the details of history. If we start really at the beginning, I beg your pardon, it was 400,000 BC when fire was first discovered by human beings, or at least that is our best guess. And coal, records of coal being used go back to ancient China in around 3000 BC, but we have good records in Europe for coal being used, particularly for metalworking, from 300 BC. But the dominant source of energy was wood, and so much so that basically in countries that were more densely populated, particularly England, you had most of the trees being cut down for wood power, primarily heat. So 20% of England was covered by forests in ancient times, and that was depleted to around 10% today. Scotland chopped down most of its forests as well, 72% cover down to 19%. And it went so fast that by the 1500s, one of the differences between England and the rest of the world is that we just did not have that much wood left. And so that drove people in England particularly to use this funny sooty black rock that could be mined in the earth for heat. It produced a greater amount of coal use. And we see this in lots of places around Europe, but it was particularly so in England because we chopped down so many of our trees. We also know from early records that coal was seen to be polluting and highly problematic right from the beginning. So an Act of Parliament in 1273, as long ago as that, said that coal burning in London was prejudicial to people's health and called for limits on coal burning. In 1306, a royal proclamation was passed against the use of soft coal in London, and we see Elizabeth I pictured here in 1578 saying in a proclamation that she was greatly aggrieved and annoyed with the taste and smoke of sea coals. So pollution has always been a problem right from the start, even with much fewer people on this planet. But also coal was seen as valuable. It wasn't monopolized by the crown as other minerals were. So the case of mines declared that by the law of England, all the mines of gold and silver belonged to the Queen. But then Parliament reacted in the Royal Mines Act of 1688 alongside the Glorious Revolution, where the monarch was kicked out and Parliament invited a new monarch, William of Orange, and sealed Parliament's dominance. And this act said that copper, tin, iron and lead could not be a royal mine monopolised by the Queen or the King. So valuable minerals were taken by the monarch, those things listed here, and also coal, which was not seen to be that important yet, were not. But it really all changed with the Industrial Revolution because, as I say, more and more coal is being mined for energy because there's a shortage of timber. And this drives one James Watt to invent a machine using steam to lift coal more quickly out of coal mines. So that was the original use of the steam engine, coal-powered steam engine. You burn the coal, which releases steam, which spins turbines. You use coal power to extract more coal. And then, of course, not long after that, it was realized that you could add some wheels to a steam engine, and hey presto, you've got your first locomotive, which turns into the railways. And that was really the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. It's so important, as I think I've said before, and I will say again, so important because for the first time in history, we had, as a human species, the ability to create vastly more energy than human beings could have done before. That led to enormous booms in production. So one of the other things that the steam engine was attached to was textile looms. So you could have mass production of textiles, spinning wool, the spinning jenny. And as I say, you've got railways, you soon got steamships, and then, of course, the sky's the limit. All with this invention of the steam engine that gives you an enormous, incredible amount of power never seen before in human history. And it also means a lot more burning of coal. And really, right from the beginning, it began to affect the climate, very gradually at first, as we'll see. But it wasn't long after the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in 1775 that in 1814, it was the last year, the River Thames in London froze over. Now, there are a few reasons for this. It wasn't only the warming of the climate, although that certainly was one. It was also the fact that London Bridge was rebuilt, and whereas before it had narrow arches that restricted the flow of the river, the arches became wider, but already with the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, the planet was starting to warm. As we now know, the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was growing. And so the last time that the Thames froze over and people had a frost fair with markets and stalls and ice skating was in the year 1814. Now, through the middle of the 19th century, of course, coal production rises enormously, and its social significance is seen everywhere. There's another story that we could spend a long time talking about on the immiseration of the working class, who have to go down the coal mines, down the pit, and stories of appalling child labour. People's lives cut short, average life expectancy something around 30 for a typical miner, because everybody dies of awful lung diseases. Writers like William Jevons in The Coal Question start to think, well, if we're extracting so much coal so fast and we're burning it so much and it's so important for our production, our machinery, our empire, then maybe it's going to run out. And of course, unfortunately, coal has not run out, and it's probably not going to, not anytime soon anyway, because we're using less of it mainly, but also there are still plenty of supplies. But even more importantly, Jevons realizes the sun is an enormous source of energy. He says in The Coal Question, the sun annually showers down upon us 1,000 times as much heat power as is contained in all the coal. And if only there was some way that all that energy in the sun could be harnessed. Now, because coal is so important for, the condition of labour, the labour movement is forming through the mining unions and making big demands for changes in the way that the coal industry works. Coal is privately owned, the coal mine owners are very concentrated, and so the labour movement is constantly calling for public ownership of coal production. There is a report of the Coal Industry Commission of 1919, where a minority of the commissioners do support nationalisation, but the majority appointed by the Liberal government do not. Conditions in coal mines remain appalling, as they always were, ameliorated somewhat, but still not that much better. And in 1926, the coal mine owners decide to cut everyone's pay. And this is the cause of the general strike of 1926, not a penny off the pay, not an hour on the day. And the long story short is that the general strike fails to prevent the wage cuts. The government backs the coal miners. The military is called in to break the strike. But not long after that, the first minority Labour government is elected, and the first majority Labour government, the people who were fighting the general strike in 1926, finally take power post-war and do bring coal into public ownership under the overview of the National Coal Board. But in the meantime, while all this is happening in coal, before in the meantime, this quote from Orwell, so he writes in 1937 that our civilization is founded on coal more completely than one realizes until one stops to think about it. The machines that keep us alive and the machines that make machines are all directly or indirectly dependent upon coal. And that was still true in 1937, but as the next chart shows, coal was about or had reached its peak at that point in the UK. This chart shows coal production and imports from 1853 up until 2018. And so Britain was a coal producing country for most of its history. And until the late 60s, early 70s, when you see the black line rising with coal being imported for the first time as coal production in Britain falls, and really because coal reserves are depleted in the UK. So here's coal production falling during the general strike of 1926. The earlier drop in production is the post-war depression and severe industrial unrest accompanies that. Orwell is writing about here, and really you can see that coal is about to go, because what's happened not long before that is that the Royal Navy switches over to oil powering its vessels in 1913. And really this is the beginning of the end of the age of coal and the transfer to the age of oil. So oil and gas really begins its life with the 1850 patent in America by Young on refining oil. Oil had been used before for small scale for heating and lamps and domestic uses, but as a source of serious power, this really begins in the late 19th century. And Standard Oil is by far the biggest company in America. Very quickly after its formation, in its refining business, in its transportation business, it manages to monopolize and cartelize almost all of the oil industry in the United States. And we're going to talk about some basic economic reasons why that's true. Oil fields might be abundant, but they're in specific locations. It takes a lot of capital in order to extract the oil, and that means that if you're a bigger business, you're going to be more efficient at extracting the oil. And of course, this is exactly the sort of natural monopoly advantages that Standard Oil took advantage of. Led by J.D. Rockefeller. And it wasn't just that the company was involved in extracting the oil around the world. The US government certainly backed Standard Oil in expanding its business. Rockefeller said in 1911, one of our greatest helpers has been the State Department to push our way into new markets to the utmost corners of the world. And the British Empire, even though it had been or become dominant through coal, certainly was involved in oil as well. The Rangoon Oil Company, most notably, was set up in 1871. Of course, Rangoon was in Burma, or what is now Myanmar today. And the Rangoon Company becomes the Burma Oil Company in 1886. and the same company is operating in the Middle East. So it is a subsidiary. It has a subsidiary which is called the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, established in 1909. And just before the switch by the Royal Navy to put its vessels to run on oil, Winston Churchill, running the Royal Navy, says that the British government should take a stake in the Anglo-Persian Oil Company in order to ensure security of supply. So public ownership of oil, believe it or not, is the dominant mode of running things throughout the 20th, or most of the 20th century, from 1913, as we're going to see, up until about 1980, in order to ensure security of supply for British military interests. In the Defence of the Realm Act, the oil companies could be, oil could be used by the government. The Petroleum Act of 1918 sets up a system where if there is any oil, it doesn't necessarily belong to the Crown, but it's illegal to extract it without a license from the Crown. So, compared to the case of the mines, saying that the Queen owns everything, the Petroleum Act of 1918 doesn't quite do that. But it says that you've got to get a license from government in order to extract. And that is what gives effectively state control over the oil industry from then on. Now, it's very clear that oil is strategically significant and has geopolitical significance, but this is spelled out several times by State Department or other military sources, which explain exactly why. The US State Department says, for example, just to take one, in 1945, that petroleum has historically played a larger part in the external relations of the USA than any other commodity. And that's quite a statement if you think about it. It's not just that the US government, like the British government, wanted to secure supply of oil all around the world wherever it could, in order to power its military and also to power its domestic industry. But it's also that oil itself, because it has so many other uses, military significance, was a major reason that enormous tactical decisions were made during for instance, the Second World War. So why did the Japanese bomb Pearl Harbor, bringing America into the war? Well, it was to ensure that the American military fleet couldn't threaten Japan's supply lines of oil. And why was it that Hitler decided in World War II the disastrous decision to try and take Stalingrad? Was it just because of the symbolic significance of Stalingrad with Stalin's name on the city that led to the appalling, bloodthirsty conflict there? No, it was also a strategic location because if you held Stalingrad, then you would be in a good position to cut off supply. I mean, if you're looking at it from the perspective of Nazi Germany, to the oil fields in the Caucasus. And we could go on. Notable example, of course, is the war in Iraq, mainly fought to secure Iraq's oil supplies, although the American government did not say it at the time, but that's certainly what it was about in retrospect. And Donald Trump just says it explicitly now with the kidnapping of Maduro from Venezuela, and he is saying in the last month or so how good this is for American oil companies to get the oil, even though they don't necessarily see it that way, because it's going to take decades to repair the infrastructure when oil is in fact on the way out. Just a little bit more about how the oil industry operated in the 20th century. The Federal Trade Commission in America, which is there to enforce antitrust law or competition law, brought an oil cartel case in 1952, but decided in the end to take no action against the big oil companies that had been Standard Oil. I should have mentioned that Standard Oil was broken up into different parts by the US Supreme Court in a famous case in the early 20th century, but then had just re-merged again after after it was broken up in 1911. And this was what became known as, or most of what was known as the Seven Sisters, the oil companies that were, as the FTC described, sharing markets around the world, effectively to cartelize supply outside the United States. In the end, with enormous political pressure, the FTC backed down and did not investigate any further if US companies gave 1% share to independent companies. But effectively, this case stands as a marker of how the US Department of Justice ceased to do any investigation into the oil cartels of their own companies outside US borders around the world. And so OPEC was formed, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, in 1960, really as a reaction to the cartelization by Western companies in order to raise and control oil prices globally through their own coordination. And a massive crisis was perpetuated in 1973, or beginning in 1973, and then again in 1979, where OPEC tripled and then tripled again the price of oil at which it sold, leading to a whole series of consequences: the collapse of the Bretton Woods system, the election of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan on the back of massive inflation and political instability. So all of these geopolitical events are fundamentally changed or fundamentally shaped by the energy system, which at the time was highly dependent on oil. And if we just go back to Britain for a second, the British oil industry was soon to be renamed as British Petroleum, but it was sold off by Margaret Thatcher when she got into power. One of the first things that they did in the Conservative government was sell off British Petroleum shares, so that it was outside of government hands, so reversing the Churchill purchase in 1913. And that is really an important decision and in some ways disastrous decision, because it meant at the very time that climate change was becoming really felt and really properly was understood, the state receded from control over the major corporations that affected climate change so much. Thatcher also privatised much later. The successor of Thatcher, John Major, privatised much later the coal industry in 1994. Of course, Thatcher had fought the miners' strike in 1984. But it wasn't until 1994, 10 years later, that the coal industry was privatised. When the coal industry, as we've seen, was already really dying and the UK was starting to import. The really big important thing in the last 2 or 3 decades has been the growth of renewables, which really are unstoppable. So it's not a question of whether, it's just a matter of when we transition from an economy based on oil and gas, as it primarily is now, and coal still in many countries, to one that is completely based on renewable, clean energy. So it's not a question of whether, because the economic fundamentals are so clear. As we'll see next week in more detail, the price of solar, wind and utility batteries has fallen so much and continues to fall that coal, oil and gas simply cannot compete. Electric cars are, as of last year, the same price and will become cheaper and cheaper and cheaper than petrol or diesel vehicles. Heat pumps and electric boilers are becoming more and more competitive with gas boilers, and soon they'll be much less expensive. And the most important thing is, of course, that fossil fuels are burning our planet. And so we've got to stop them. And coordinated action to do this really began with the Paris Agreement of 2015, which said the countries around the world agreed to ensure that emissions were limited so that the temperature doesn't rise globally more than 2 degrees, with an ambition to stay under 1.5 degrees. And then you have national action, like in the UK, the Climate Change Act 2008, which targets reductions of emissions in order to get to net zero, in the UK's case, by 2050. So the coal plants are closing. although many old coal plants in Britain have been replaced by wood. Oh, well, they replaced the coal with wood pellets, which is still bad for the environment in several ways we can talk about later. We've got bans on the internal combustion engine on their way, but not yet. We've got bans on gas boilers coming, but not yet. And the only question is how fast we can accelerate this to end fossil fuels. Because here is the problem in the chart. For most of human history, there were 280 parts per million, roughly, of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, or in the air that you breathe. Another way to put it, with every breath you take, 0.028% of what you breathe in is carbon dioxide. But since the Industrial Revolution, that percentage has been going up and up. So in 2024, it was 424 parts per million, or you're breathing in almost double the carbon dioxide that you used to. And this is bad because it creates global warming through the greenhouse effect. So the more carbon dioxide that there is in the atmosphere, the more heat that gets trapped when the sun's rays come into the Earth. They bounce back and go off into space, most of them. But if you've got more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it's like a blanket being wrapped around the Earth. And so it insulates the escape of heat from the sun. So we want some greenhouse effect, but not too much. Methane, of course, is another greenhouse gas. And all of these things are produced in vast quantities by the burning of fossil fuels. And so we are currently on an exponential curve. And the only way that this can stop, the only way that global warming can stop, is very simply if we stop fossil fuels and also find ways, which we will need to certainly grow more trees, but also have direct air capture of carbon dioxide and other fossil fuels in order to try and get the climate back to what it was. But the first step is to stop coal and oil and gas. So the human rights that are at stake in this topic are, well, at least 3 or 4 types. The first one, very simply, is the right to life. So under the European Convention on Human Rights, Article 2, also the Universal Declaration, Article 3, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 6, very simply, everyone has a right to life. And as we're about to see, courts are interpreting the right to life to include the right to see governments, at least starting with governments, to take action to stop climate damage from fossil fuels. So that's the first thing. Second human right at stake in this topic is that everyone has the right to share in scientific advancement and its benefits. We see that in the Universal Declaration and the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. And this right goes back to the New Deal in America, for example, with distributing a polio vaccine. Private companies weren't doing it by themselves, so government needed to take positive action. Or, for example, with rural electrification. Private electricity companies didn't want to connect everybody's homes in Alabama or rural Louisiana. And so it was seen that government needed to take positive steps in order to ensure that everybody was connected to the electricity grid. Same with renewable energy today. Markets are not going to distribute renewable energy to everyone just through private enterprise. Positive state action is definitely going to be needed in order to accelerate this. And that's the concept that's being expressed in this idea that everyone has a right to share in the benefits of science. Now then we've got a couple of rights in the international covenants on disposal of natural resources. So it says everyone has the right to, or all peoples have the right to freely dispose of their natural wealth and resources for the principle of mutual benefit. In no case may a people be deprived of its own means of subsistence. The International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights says the same thing. Right of all peoples to enjoy and utilise freely and fully their natural wealth and resources. And so historically we might have thought when it was written, framers probably had in mind digging up coal and oil and gas and natural minerals and so forth. But as a simple matter of interpretation of the text, we can very clearly see that natural resources can encompass a other things like the wind, the sun, sea levels which are stable, a climate which is stable. These are natural resources as well. And we've got a very simple problem where the burning of oil and gas and coal by rich countries and developed countries is harming the right to natural resources of other countries which have not been burning so much coal and oil and gas. It is threatening everybody's stable climate. And so internally contradicting within this right is that some natural resources can harm other natural resources. And a simple interpretation, how do you reconcile this, would be to say that the natural resources which don't harm others are the ones which should prevail. And so inherently in this right, paradoxically, I think that we can argue that there is another reason why coal and oil and gas have to cease, because all peoples have a right to enjoy natural resources, and that includes a stable climate and living planet. And then you've got, in many constitutions, many constitutional documents like the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union, a right to the improvement of the quality of the environment, often as a programmatic right, but that certainly encompasses combating climate change. The Sustainable Development Goals from the UN don't really help us much in this field. The relevant ones are Goal 13, which says that by 2030, everyone around the world has to take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. And one of the targets underneath this, 13.2, says that states should integrate climate change measures into national policies, strategies, and planning. But what the Sustainable Development Goals aren't saying is the obvious thing, and addressing the elephant in the room, which is that you've got to ban coal and oil and gas, or all but ban it. I mean, you can have small amounts being used for necessary plastic production. Of course, plastics are another big topic, but you're still going to have a little bit of coal, a little bit of oil, a little bit of gas, but minuscule compared to the order that we use today for our energy system. Goal 7 says that we should ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable and modern energy. Target 7.2 says that we should substantially increase the share of renewable energy in the global energy mix, looking at renewables as a percentage of the total final consumption. And that's been rising, but again, what it's not doing is saying the obvious, which is we need to go to 100% clean energy as fast as possible. So these targets are pretty vague and significantly less than the human rights that we've just been talking, which don't have such a slow or vague timetable. The human rights should be realized immediately. So now, before we get into more of the law on finance, governance and rights, let's look at the market failures in this field. So the first market failure is that oil and gas reserves, like coal fields, are natural monopolies. And on top of that, on top of being in a geographically specific location, they have very high capital costs to extract them. So in order to build an oil well, you need a significant amount of capital. You need the steel, you need the infrastructure to build the oil rigs if it's out at sea, or even if it's inland, you've got to have a lot of heavy machinery, which not everybody has access to. And certainly in the way that oil is being extracted today, in ever more complicated ways, resource-intensive ways, it is only a tiny number of companies that have the resources to extract oil and gas and coal on the scale at which they are done in modern industry. And so because you've got these very high capital costs and you've got natural monopoly, ownership in these industries tends to concentrate, as it always has done. And so markets simply fail to work in a competitive way, and that being so, there is a very good case for public ownership and regulation. Secondly, we know that the oil industry globally is completely cartelized. As mentioned before, you had the Seven Sisters in mid-20th century onwards. You have OPEC and state policies in Britain, in America, everywhere around the world to back their national champions or their national cartels in order to secure supplies of energy. Because it is so important for domestic industry and the protection of global power. And so it's fictitious to think of a normal market in oil. Around the world, you certainly can see a market price of oil, Brent crude being one of the standards, but this is not a market in any normal sense because you've got state power and you've got state ownership and you've got state regulation rigging the market in order to get the interests that the state or the different states around the world have. Thirdly, you've got massive asymmetries in information, as we're about to talk about soon. Oil companies, just to give one example, have systematically concealed the effects of their industry on the climate. They've done it from the start, and also, in other ways, because they're so big, they just know more than a typical consumer, so they can't be a properly functioning market in any real sense when you've got a big oil company dealing with a small individual or consumer. No symmetry of information, let alone equality of bargaining power. And the fourth big market failure, of course, is climate change itself, or climate damage, because this is an enormous negative externality. Oil companies like BP, Shell, Chevron, Exxon are not paying for the enormous damage that they have done to the ecosphere. All the pollution from gas, oil, coal that causes climate damage is being paid for by the planet as a whole, society as a whole, while companies are still profiting. And this goes even further when wars are being fought over oil. So the million or more people that were killed in the appalling Iraq conflict from 2003 onwards are the casualties of a war for oil. The crisis in Venezuela, if it leads to violence, in Donald Trump's own words, will be a group of casualties from the quest for oil and the attempt to give American oil companies access to Venezuelan markets. Hopefully it doesn't come to conflict and the situation can stabilize, but these are very real negative externalities from the fact of the way that the oil industry works. And on the flip side, clean air and a stable climate are public goods, and these things are not invested in properly when they're left to the market. So that's just another reason why you need public ownership and regulation in this field. And the final market failure that is intimately connected to the fossil fuel industry is massive inflation. So the two the two biggest periods of inflation in modern history are in the 1970s, with the OPEC crisis tripling the price of oil, tripling again, led to double-digit inflation in the UK, the US, and then also recently with Russia's invasion of the Ukraine in 2022, you have an enormous spike in energy costs around the world. Gas prices spike because of the invasion, and this is because Russia was able to restrict supplies of gas, and the crisis was used around the world by oil and gas companies to raise prices, and it precipitated a cost of living crisis as well. And it's really important to see that this volatility in price does not exist with renewable energies, because the flow of solar energy, the flow of the wind turbine, energy generated by wind turbines is pretty constant. And so when we transition to renewable clean energy, these problems of massive inflation are simply not going to exist. And so for all those reasons, fossil fuels are an incredibly bad source of energy for the economy, especially when we've got alternatives which are cheaper and cleaner. So let's get into the finance of fossil fuels and how they can also be defunded. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the finance of oil, gas, and coal. And you might think that with the typical oil company listed on a stock exchange like BP, Shell, Exxon, Chevron, that the main way in which they are financed is by raising equity from shareholders or they finance themselves through debt, or perhaps they're financing themselves by making profit and then reinvesting in a company in a nice, clean way. But you would be wrong about that because, of course, these are finance mechanisms, but the primary ways in which oil companies, gas companies, coal companies are financing themselves is through, well, the things that are listed here. So the law is allowing the externalization of costs from the production of fossil fuels onto the rest of society in many, many different ways. So the first thing that we're going to look at is the fact that there are climate targets which actually allow pollution to continue. Net zero by 2050 means that you can pollute right up till 2050 and not be net zero. There's an almost total failure in climate litigation, although there has been a lot of exciting successes to ensure that oil companies pay for the damage they cause, or fossil fuel companies pay for the damage that they cause. There's the externalization of costs onto populations around the world suffering under dictatorships where elites gain control over natural monopolies, and almost like a resource curse, countries end up falling into a downward spiral towards despotism. You have the effects of inflation on the economy and society from fossil fuels volatility. And then also there are state subsidies, explicitly or implicitly, in the fact that people running fossil fuel companies can get very cheap access to resources. So let's go through all of these. First of all, we've got the fact that climate damage targets, or targets to what seem to be stopping climate damage, are actually, if we think about it, enabling pollution. So if we go back really to the beginning when this was first talked about, although the history goes back a bit further, but a really significant point was already in 1965 there was a report to the United States President Lyndon Johnson that carbon emissions will, according to the report, produce marked changes in climate that may be deleterious from the point of view of human beings. And then ExxonMobil itself, or Exxon, in research in 1977, which was internal but has since been revealed, showed that they knew that mankind, quote, is influencing the global climate through carbon dioxide release from the burning of fossil fuels. So they already knew in 1997. Humanity didn't really start doing much about it until the Kyoto Protocol attached to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, but really that didn't lead to much until the Paris Agreement saw countries around the world commit to keeping global temperatures under 2 degrees with an ambition that it should rise to no more than 1.5 degrees. But if we think about this, this is allowing the climate to be damaged so much that the Earth will heat by 2 degrees if in fact we actually achieve that target. We've already missed the 1.5 degree target because 2 years ago, I think, or maybe it was last year, we already hit 1.5 degrees in average warming. And of course, scientifically, it has to be sustained over a number of years, but we're already there. And so that means that the urgency is just even greater to stop fossil fuels. As mentioned before, you've got the Climate Change Act 2008, which in sections 1 to 4 set a target of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 100% compared to where they were in 1990. So that effectively means eliminating them. The target for that is 2050. So that's where we get this phrase net zero by 2050. But the problem with this, and in fact all the nationally determined contributions that countries pledge to make under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, is that it doesn't look at several really important things. So first of all, if we're reducing emissions in the UK, that doesn't factor in emissions that are embedded in products that we're importing from foreign countries. So all the manufacturing has gone in the UK, it's gone to China and India and Bangladesh and so on. Where products are made that are very carbon intensive, dirty energy, and then the products are imported into the UK. But that does not count to the UK's nationally determined contributions to reducing emissions. Secondly, so that's a big blind spot. Secondly, and this is really, really the most important, is that we're not looking at what UK companies do abroad. So BP, Shell, Glencore in particular, producing or responsible for massive amounts of greenhouse gas emissions around the world. They're headquartered in London, they're listed on the London Stock Exchange, but their carbon emissions around the world aren't part of the UK's nationally determined contributions or anything to do with reduction of emissions under the Climate Change Act 2008. And so that is a really big problem. And the third factor is that the Climate Change Act is setting a very distant target of 2050 to reduce emissions. But what we really need is an action now, as fast as technology allows. What the Act does is it sets up a series of carbon budgets, which go roughly every 4 years. And we're currently in the fourth carbon budget at the moment. And just to give you an idea of what we need with gradual reduction, by the sixth carbon budget due in 2037, effectively we need to have all electric vehicles and to end gas heating. This, by the way, completely is contradicted by another piece of legislation, the Petroleum Act 1998, which in 2015 was amended to insert Section 9A that says the North Sea Transition Authority, which is used to be the Oil and Gas Authority, has a duty to maximise the economic recovery of petroleum. So, even though you've got these high-level targets in the Climate Change Act 2008, they're very distant, and particular bits of legislation in the UK can completely contradict the scheme of trying to reduce emissions. There hasn't been a joined-up way of thinking about these issues. Now let's just focus on the big companies abroad, because this really is the one that matters. If we look at our biggest three polluters in the UK, BP, Shell and Glencore. Of course, Glencore does a lot of coal, BP and Shell, they're oil and gas. And you add up their emissions worldwide, that comes to 13 times the UK's entire emissions. So, the Climate Change Act by 2050 goal might be hit, reducing emissions to zero. But, we live on the same planet as the rest of the world in Britain. And so if we do nothing about BP and Shell and Glencore, then it really isn't going to stop the planet burning, the seas rising and flooding London and countries all around the coast. So it really does matter that the Climate Change Act doesn't do anything about this. And so that's something that we've got to consider very seriously. It's not only British companies. British companies are, however, some of the biggest polluters in modern history. So this table shows the top 25 carbon emitters in history. It looks at corporations, but it also looks at state entities where the states have played a large part in the economy. So at the top is China, coal and cement. Then you've got the former Soviet Union. But then you've got Saudi Aramco, the state Saudi oil company. You've got Chevron in the United States at number 4. So they're responsible for 13%, 7%, 3.4%, 3.1%, respectively, of all historic emissions, all historic greenhouse gas emissions. Exxon, Gazprom, there's BP, the UK at number 7, with 2.29% of all historic greenhouse gas emissions. And then at number 8, you've got Shell, 2.18%. And you go down the list and you see other national champions. But when we add it all up, around 90 companies are responsible for 63% of all historic greenhouse gas emissions. That's an incredible concentration of responsibility. And I think it's really important to see that it's not as if it's all of us that are somehow responsible for climate change because we all make individual consumption decisions. No, the reality is that the energy system is incredibly concentrated globally. There's a tiny number of companies that are corporations that are responsible for massive amounts of emissions. They profit from them. And so that's where the target of regulation really needs to focus. Now, you might say, well, if these companies are so big, if they're so important, maybe it's really hard to get rid of them. And the answer to that is very simply no, it's not, because we already have the technology that can replace petroleum, gas, and coal to be much more cheap and much more clean. And I can illustrate that through this chart, which shows UK final energy consumption by fuel types from 1999 to 2024. So the good news is that the UK is becoming more energy efficient, sloping down in the total energy consumption. The bad news is that quite a lot of that is because the UK's manufacturing industry was decimated since the Thatcher government, and so quite a lot of manufacturing, which would have been more energy intensive, has been relocated to countries like India and China. But the other bit of good news that we can see is that in the middle, you see the yellow strip, that's electricity. And below that, in the grey, is gas. And above that, in the brown, is petroleum. And very, very simply, all the petroleum can go because that is really transport. And all transport, except for planes at the moment, but planes are coming soon, all transport can be electrified. So very simply, that yellow bit just needs to expand upwards to take away all the petroleum as we roll out electric cars, electric trucks, electric vans, electric trains. And the grey part, which is gas, is mainly heating. And so very simply, all that needs to happen is that heat pumps replace gas boilers, or electric boilers replace gas boilers. And so the very simple thing that we need to do is make that yellow most of the chart. And that's something that we've already got the technology to do. It's just a matter of when, not whether. In the European Union, I think it's important to look at the comparative legislation. So the European Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, Article 194, says that the European Union's aims are to have a functioning energy market, security of supply, energy efficiency, but the EU should also respect member states' choice of different energy sources, although not entirely, because what the EU definitely does want to do is drive towards energy efficiency and clean energy, and protection of the environment is one of the core aims of the EU in the Treaty on the European Union, Article 3. To legislate in these fields, there's a special legislative procedure, has to be unanimous agreement if something is of fiscal nature, but to drive at clean energy, you just need the ordinary special, you need the special legislative procedure. So, for example, we've got the climate neutrality regulation from the EU, which, like the Climate Change Act in the UK, has now set a target of being net zero climate neutral by 2050, but also an interim target of a 55% fall in emissions by 2030 compared to 1990 levels. And a lot of that is going to depend upon the electrification in the next few years of transport, as more and more cars and trucks go electric. Really important after the appalling invasion of Ukraine by Russia in 2022, the Repower EU communication set a goal of ending reliance on Russian fossil fuels. And of course, that's important because Putin runs a dictatorship in Russia that is invading other countries like Ukraine, Georgia, and so on. And so getting out of fossil fuels is not only good for the environment, but is also good to break away the power of despots like Putin. Then we've got the Renewable Energy Directive 2018, which targets at least 42.5% of gross final energy consumption by 2030 being renewable. This target was put up because renewable energy was being deployed more than had previously been expected, from 32%. The previous target for 2020, which was met, was 2020, and there are also individual member state targets. And this looks at electricity, heating, cooling, and transport. But the thing the EU has been more slow on is simply banning the harmful activities, which is what ultimately we need to do. There's no bans yet on coal, power generation or gas generation, both of which can be replaced with utility scale batteries, if not nuclear or hydro energy. There is a gas boiler ban in new buildings, or I beg your pardon, sooner than there is a gas boiler ban in new buildings coming quite soon under the Energy Performance Buildings Directive 2024. There should be a complete ban by 2040 on gas boilers in all buildings. And there is a ban on internal combustion engines, originally mooted for 2035, but now there's some exceptions being created. The reality is, however, that electric vehicles are going to be cheaper than the internal combustion engine up front this year, next year, and the price is going to continue to fall. So quite why these bans are taking so long to implement is not really clear. Probably just a lack of political will. Okay, but bottom line is the first way in which fossil fuel companies are being subsidized is by a complete lack of ambition in state targets to phase out fossil fuels. They are being allowed to continue despite the harm that they cause to the environment and despite the lack of economic sense that continuing to use them makes. Second way in which fossil fuel companies are subsidized is simply by not paying for the damage that they cause. And the courts have been very, very slow, pretty much worldwide, in imposing any liability. So we're going to talk about some success stories, but the bottom line is that a case has not succeeded yet in holding fossil fuel companies liable for climate damage. In America, nothing is happening at all because in a disastrous decision by the whole US Supreme Court, American Electric Power and Connecticut, it was held that the Environmental Protection Agency had jurisdiction over clean air, and this preempted federal tort law claims and public nuisance claims against power companies. So you can't use tort law in America to sue power companies for pollution because the federal government supposedly has jurisdiction which preempts private law. Not a necessary decision from the text of the statute, but that's what the US Supreme Court held in yet another completely regressive decision. Highly reactionary. That's not the case in other countries around the world. So one of the big cases just recently is called Smith and Fonterra Cooperative Group Limited from the New Zealand Supreme Court. So this was about Mr. Smith, who claimed that a group of subsidiaries of Exxon, BP, JP Morgan, Invesco, and so on should be held liable in negligence or private nuisance and public nuisance for damage to a property that was near the coast and is being put at risk by rising sea levels. It was argued that by the defendants that the claim should simply be struck out, but the Supreme Court allowed the case to go to trial for Mr. Smith to sue for nuisance, arguing also that negligence liability was possible and followed similar principles, rejecting that the damage to Mr. Smith's property was not foreseeable, that the potential harm lacked proximity, or that it would be too remote. Nobody won yet. Mr. Smith didn't win yet. It still has to go to trial, but the case wasn't struck out by the New Zealand Supreme Court. There hasn't been a case brought in England and Wales yet, but there are almost identical principles, identical case law being followed by the New Zealand courts as well as English courts. And so an English court would have to answer very similar questions. Is harm reasonably foreseeable from fossil fuel emissions from a fossil fuel company, proximate, and is it just to impose a duty of care? Is there a breach? Does the breach cause damage? Is the damage too remote? And the unspoken thing, which is that are there any public policy factors that make the courts too timid to actually impose liability? So all of these things could be litigated, and I'm sure will at some point in the UK in tort litigation as climate damage worsens. Now, we've also got cases in Germany and the Netherlands. So, this is all private law. Different rules and different principles are followed in the civil code, but basically the same reasoning works everywhere, which is that if somebody harms you, they should pay compensation. And then the question is, can it be made out that the harm is caused by the defendant? So the issue in Liuwa and RWE, RWE is a big German power company, was about a melting glacier in Peru that was threatening to flood a village where Mr. Liuwa lives. Mr. Liuwa, with a group of people who work in London and in Germany, organized to sue RWE in tort because they said that the greenhouse gas emissions from RWE were 0.47% of historical greenhouse gas emissions, so they should be liable to pay for 0.47% of the flood defense costs. The upper state court of Hamm in Germany held that there could, in principle, be liability under the German Civil Code, the BGB, Article 1004. But unfortunately, on the facts, it held that the risk of flooding from the glacier melt was only under 1% and therefore not enough for any liability to be made out. So in principle, it was a win, but no liability at all yet. Then you've got Milieu Défense and Friends of the Earth against Royal Dutch Shell in the Netherlands in 2024. This was a case that alleged that under the Dutch Civil Code, section 162 of Book 6, Shell was failing to follow the Paris Agreement, and this should be considered to be a tort. And in the Netherlands, it is very well understood that interpreting private law, you've got to take into account principles of human rights. Here, the right to life under Articles 2 and 8. The Hague District Court held that, in principle, Shell, or not in principle, but in fact, Shell did have a duty to cut its emissions according to the Paris Agreement by 45% by 2030, the same as the Netherlands' nationally determined contributions, and that should include scopes 1, 2, and 3. So including when Shell not just is drilling the oil out of the ground, the emissions that it creates then, but scope 3, when it sells the oil to people and that it gets burned and this produces emissions, Shell is also responsible for that. And it was held that Shell needed to take immediate action. It did. Shell immediately relocated its headquarters out of the Netherlands, out of Amsterdam to London, and it removed the Royal and the Dutch from its name. So it's just Shell PLC now. The Court of Appeal reversed part of the judgment, and it held that an injunction could not be awarded against Shell to make it comply with the need to reduce its emissions by 45% by 2030. But the case is being appealed to the Supreme Court, so it still needs to abide by the ruling. Shell hasn't really been abiding by the ruling, but this is another indication that liability risks for companies are growing all the time. And in fact, I should also just mention research by the Grantham Research Institute at the London School of Economics found that when climate litigation cases like this are brought, they have a statistically significant impact on the share prices of companies. So really what we want to do, if we want to make sure that these companies are shut down, is bring as many actions against them as is possible to make them pay for the harm that they cause everyone. Now, we don't only have climate litigation cases against companies, we've also got them against states. And actually, these have been a little bit more successful. No company held liable to pay compensation for damage yet, but there has been some significant movement in the cases against states. So in Urgenda and the Netherlands, there was a claim that the Dutch state had failed to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions as quickly as was required under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. The IPCC said the minimum reduction in emissions should be 25 to 40% for rich countries, and the Dutch Supreme Court held the Netherlands had broken its duty, interpreted in light of the right to life under the European Convention. And I think that's really important because it showed very clearly that the right to life was relevant to climate change duties and that state duties should be interpreted in line with human rights. Then you had the Klimaschutz case in Germany, or the climate protection case in 2021. And this was a claim that there was a duty on the government to protect the right to life and the environment under the German constitution, pretty analogous to the European Convention. And the Bundesverfassungsgericht, the German Constitutional Court, held that the German government had been acting too slowly, and this was infringing or violating the rights of young people, because if you don't cut carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions quickly now, that means that there will have to be a very quick reduction of emissions later on. That puts a disproportionate burden on young people, and that violates their rights under the German constitution. Third case, even more significant because it's the European Court of Human Rights, is the Klimasinjerinnen and Switzerland case. So the elderly the elderly ladies case and Switzerland. So this was a group of claimants that claimed that Switzerland's failure to cut emissions in line with IPCC targets was affecting their health. So there were heat waves in Switzerland, as there are everywhere, and in fact one of the claimants did in fact die during the course of the litigation. The Court of Human Rights, very long judgment, but basically agrees that it's a violation of the right to life for Switzerland to not take action to cut its emissions in line with international law. In paragraph 545, it says that the state's primary duty is to adopt and to effectively apply in practice regulations and measures capable of mitigating the existing and potentially irreversible future effects of climate change. So that was a really big win, and that's binding right around Europe. So that means in UK litigation, when we're interpreting any piece of domestic law, statute or common law, has to be interpreted in line with the convention, the right to life, which means cutting greenhouse gas emissions. So third form of finance for fossil fuel companies is not paying for the externalities that they cause to populations around the world. So rich countries like those in Europe or America are fossil fuel consumers, but the big fossil fuel producers, the big oil exporters, are the countries that you can see in the map here. And basically there are a whole bunch of dictatorships. So you've got Saudi Arabia, you've got Kuwait, you've got Iran, you've got Russia, you've got Iraq, UAE, all countries with failing democracies, all countries that have struck it big with oil. And this is what we call the resource curse. So when you get oil, you might think that it's really good, it's going to make you rich, but actually if you've got an unstable democracy or you've got an existing dictatorship, it's likely that the elites will capture the resources or the revenue from the resources and use that revenue to entrench their power. And that's what we see time and time and time and again. If you've already got a stable democracy, like Norway, for instance, and then you get rich with oil, that can be good. But in many cases, it still creates lots of problems. I mean, a case in point is the American government, which has, through enormous oil companies and enormous corporate wealth, has, because money can be used in the political system, has seen a descent into more and more authoritarian power being gathered by the executive and failure of democracy in the United States. And this is in no small part because of the phenomenon of the resource curse. Okay, so fourth way in which fossil fuel companies are subsidized is not paying for the external effects on the economy. So inflation from fossil fuel price volatility, causing inflation, which leads to unemployment, is not something that Chevron, Exxon, BP, and Shell pay for. So I mentioned before, two big crises to do with oil and inflation were the formation of OPEC in the 70s and the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, which leads to restriction of gas supplies. All of these things don't need to happen once we shift to clean energy because the sun, the wind, water, hydroelectricity, utility scale batteries cannot be monopolized in the same way, and they won't be possessed by dictator countries. And the final way in which oil companies, fossil fuel companies, get financed is through cheap access to resources. So under the Continental Shelf Act of 1964, excuse me, Section 1, it says that rights to the seabed and subsoil and the natural resources are vested in Her Majesty, and that means that they can be licensed out by the government. Under the Petroleum Act 1998, we have the main framework, which we'll get into under governance. So through the licensing system, the state can give out access to resources, and it can do it on very, very cheap terms. And that is, in fact, what happens. There are other ways in which resources can be given away more cheaply. One of them is illustrated by this case, Bacado and Star Energy UK Onshore Limited. This was a claim in trespass where Star Energy was drilling a diagonal well that went down 250 metres below the ground and 950 metres below the land. It was underneath somebody else's property, and they sued for trespass, arguing that they should get a share of the profits because the oil well was literally under their feet. And, you know, in sort of ordinary theory, if you own a piece of land, if you own freehold, you own it to the core of the earth, to the heavens. But the UK Supreme Court held that they would only get nominal damages. They didn't have a right to share of profits, and that effectively meant that the oil company could drill under somebody's land for oil and not pay a dime to the people who actually owned the land. The law was amended in the Infrastructure Act 2015 after this case to make sure that it was clear in statute that people don't have any rights to their land anymore under 300 meters. So that means that oil companies can drill anywhere if they've got a license. So, you know, these are different ways in which oil companies, fossil fuel companies are subsidized, they are financed, and they don't pay for them. So now we've got to ask, how can oil companies be governed better? Okay, so now we're going to talk about the governance of oil, gas and coal companies and the way in which this differs to what we ordinarily expect is that companies like BP, Shell and Glencore are private limited companies, or at least they're publicly traded, but they are private companies, they're not publicly owned. And so they generally follow the typical pattern of corporate governance, that is, that the board of directors largely appoint their own successors. They can be removed by the shareholders. The shareholder votes are monopolized by very large asset managers. And normal investors have very little voice. In the UK, workers have very little voice. But even though they follow the standard governance patterns of other companies, oil, gas and coal companies are very different in their governance structure because of the things that we're about to discuss. So we're going to go through what used to be called the Oil and Gas Authority, now the North Sea Transition Authority and the Coal Authority, which are the regulators for the industry. Nothing can be done without their permission. We're going to look a little bit at the licensing and the planning rules. There's different rules for these companies when they decommission their oil rigs, and that affects their insolvency procedures. Although this applies to every company, we're going to look in a bit more detail than we would have done in insolvency or corporate governance at a procedure called winding up in the public interest, because oil and gas and coal companies very clearly are operating against the public interest because they profit from climate damage. Okay, so first thing is the North Sea Transition Authority. It used to be called the Oil and Gas Authority, which was established under the Energy Act 2016 in its current form. It got the name North Sea Transition Authority. And of course, the emphasis there is that we're transitioning away from oil and gas out of the North Sea around the United Kingdom between the UK and Norway or the Netherlands. Now, the framework for the North Sea Transition Authority's powers is found in the Petroleum Act 1998. So the board is appointed by the Secretary of State, and its role is that it issues licenses to search and bore for and get petroleum on any terms that the Secretary of State thinks fit. The Secretary of State can charge money for the right to have licenses, such consideration as it, with the consent of the Treasury, may determine. So it can really set any price it likes, and it is going to do that according to whatever the economic and energy policy of the government at the time is. It operates largely independently. So Section 9 says the Secretary of State can issue directions to the North Sea Transition Authority exceptionally. In other words, it can't issue directions unless there are exceptional circumstances. But as I say, they're very closely involved in setting the prices at which plots of the sea are auctioned off for oil drilling companies. And probably the most corrosive part of the Petroleum Act was introduced in 2015 under the Infrastructure Act. Under Section 9A, the North Sea Transition Authority had, or at least, well, it still has in law, but not so much in reality now, the objective of maximising the economic recovery of UK petroleum. And of course, this is so problematic because it completely contradicts the framework in the Climate Change Act 2008, Section 1 onwards, that wants to get us to net zero. And you really cannot do that. Everybody's completely clear about this if you are issuing new oil and gas licenses. And it's also completely in tension with the Climate Change Act that oil and gas licenses which have already been issued are still being exploited. So every drop of oil that we get out of the ground is causing us more climate damage, and this is completely at odds with the efforts to keep a living planet through the Climate Change Act's framework. Now then we've got the Coal Authority. So under Section 1 of the Coal Industry Act 1994, the Coal Authority holds rights in unworked coal, and it licenses coal mining operations. And just so we're clear, you can't mine coal unless you've got a license. You can't drill for oil unless you've got a license from the North Sea Transition Authority. Coal Authority is appointed by the Secretary of State, like the NSTA is. 2 to 8 people are on the board, and their objective is to try and have an economically viable coal mining industry, which of course, written in 1994, that might have made a bit more sense, but because coal is definitely a lot more expensive than solar, wind, and utility scale batteries now, it's one of the most expensive forms of energy, far more expensive than gas. It's really a sort of oxymoron to think about an economically viable coal mining industry, because none of it is economically viable at all anymore now that we've got clean, cheap, renewable energy that needs to be rolled out fast. Okay, so their licensing powers are the main thing. And what we're going to go through happily since I wrote the book is how actually most of this has become redundant because the licensing of new oil and gas and coal has really stopped. However, if you get a change of government and you get political parties like Reform or perhaps the Conservatives who are promising to open up fossil fuel industry again, like Trump, unfortunately, this stuff could come back. So we still kind of need to know what's there, and also to understand how the existing companies that do have licenses operate and the conditions under which they operate. So if you get a license for oil, this is a contractual, or it's of a contractual nature. The state is making a contract with the company, a license to get oil out of the ground or the sea. And implicitly, therefore, the state has effective property rights, even though there might be some ambiguity. You can't get the oil out of the ground without the state. And therefore, the state really has responsibility if it chooses to not keep oil in the ground as it really should be doing. So this is seen in the Petroleum Act 1998, and oil licenses, although they're contractual in nature, they're done through a statutory instrument. I'll show you a map in a second of different statutory instruments allowing for drilling of different parts of the North Sea. So there have been 33 licensing rounds. These come every few years, or did come every few years under the auspices of the Oil and Gas Authority, now the NSTA. The last round was from 2022 up until 2024. But the Labour government, when it got into power in 2024, in the I think it was the June election, ended new oil and gas rounds. So instead, there's going to be licensing rounds for carbon storage. So that is what is happening. No more oil and gas. There's going to be licensing for carbon storage. And so that's the idea, that we can capture carbon from power plants and store it and basically bury it in different ways. All of the rules in the UK are consistent with the European directive, the Hydrocarbons Directive, which was implemented through the Hydrocarbons Licensing Directive Regulation in 1995. And this says that applications have to be judged on technical and financial capability. The methods have to be transparent. Price, conduct of the oil companies, all has to be objective criteria, which determines who gets the license. People have to be treated equally, and the criteria have to be objective and non-discriminatory. And advertisements have to be public. There's also, I think, an important provision to mention, or a group of provisions in the Annual Financial Statements Directive 2013, which requires disclosure of any payments that are made by oil companies or gas companies around the world to governments over 100,000 euros. So, of course, the licensing regime applies to domestic oil production. But it's also important that they're operating all around the world. There's a great deal of bribery. It's a pretty dirty business, both for the environment and politically. And so in an effort to stamp down on corruption, payments over 100,000 euros have to be disclosed. And then there's the Petroleum Licensing Production Seaward Area Regulations of 2008. And this has a group of model clauses for petroleum licenses, so you don't have to rewrite a new license, a new contract every time. And the standard model was that you get an exploration license for between 2 and 4 years. And if you manage to find oil and gas, good, you will get usually an 18-year period to try and extract that production license. On top of the license, there was a whole other series of rules, hoops that oil and gas companies had to jump through. So you also have to get permission from the Health and Safety Executive to accept any design notifications for oil rigs, pipelines, and so on. You've got to do, importantly, an environmental impact assessment for any production which is over 500 tonnes of oil per day. And the rules on environmental impact assessments come from another European directive, and they're implemented by the Town and Country Planning Environmental Impact Assessment Regulations of 2017. And I should just highlight that although the Oil and Gas Authority was renamed the North Sea Transition Authority, the powers that they have to license oil and gas also apply to onshore oil production and fracking, as we're about to look at in a second. So although the big money is in the North Sea, it was also for onshore oil production. And that leads us to the next case, which is really important. So in Finch and Surrey County Council in 2024, there was a judicial review by Finch and others against Surrey County Council's permit for the drilling of 6 oil wells. And they claimed that when an environmental impact assessment was done by the council, it failed to consider the emissions that would come from burning the oil. The oil companies were adamant that if you do an environmental impact assessment, it should take account of, any greenhouse gas emissions that are produced when the oil well is being drilled. But it shouldn't take account of further emissions downstream, in other words, when the oil is taken out of the ground and it is being burnt by consumers. So the Supreme Court, by a majority, Lord Leggatt giving the main judgment, held that environmental impact assessment needs to include, according to the legislation, direct and indirect significant effects of a project. And according to the majority, this must include, logically, emissions from burning oil, not just building an oil well. And in the jargon, this is not just scope 1 and 2, but also scope 3, which refers to consumers' use of the final product. Two of the judges in pretty regressive decisions, Lord Sales and Lord Richards, they dissent based on a rather tortured reading of the directive. They said that the general scheme did not include or did not need to include consideration of scope 3 emissions, but it seems clearly that the majority was right, and that Lord Richards and Lord Sales were doing more of a purposive judgment based on their own private understanding or political preferences. So if you have a look at the map of the North Sea, this is what drilling for oil looks like. So each one of those different colours refers to a different place where some company has been given a license, and you can see in the list in the bottom left there's a different statutory instrument which maps on to different places that the oil drilling was taking place. But there's not going to be any more since 2024 unless there's an election and reform and other climate change deniers win power. So the next thing is that fracking also required licenses, but it's been gone since 2019. And of course, there were massive protests over fracking. Hydraulic fracturing, the sort of proper name, is where you have gas deposits under the surface of the earth, and you have very heavy machinery which shoots down steam in order to try and break the crust of the earth in order to release the gas. So basically you're causing a mini earthquake, and you don't have to be a structural engineer or a physicist to know that causing mini earthquakes might lead to a lot of risks, and basically people don't want fracking nearby them. So after a great deal of political pressure, particularly from the opposition Labour Party, or when it was in opposition, fracking was banned through the after the 2019 general election. Even though Labour lost, they forced the Conservative Party into the position of banning fracking. And of course, there were plenty of people in the Conservative Party who saw that it was absolutely bonkers to be fracking for gas when there are so many health and safety risks, and when fossil fuels need to be phased out anyway. So there were even more procedures that needed to be go through in order to do fracking. You needed to get permission from the North Sea Transition Authority, or ex-Oil and Gas Authority, which consulted with the Environment Agency, the Health and Safety Executive, and the HPA. You also needed to get permission from the Coal Authority and the Environment Agency if coal or radioactive material were nearby. You needed to get approval from the Mineral Planning Authority, from the local council. That's probably the big one, or the one most likely to object. You need to get permission for proper waste disposal, for abnormal water use, and you need to get approval from the British Geological Survey if you were doing a borehole that was over 30 metres or roughly 30 metres, 100 feet deep below the ground. And the important thing about this, lots more rules that you could read into, there's statutory instruments, legislation. The more complex that the procedure is, the more avenues potentially that there were for challenge legally and politically. But most of the cases that were taken failed. An example of that is the Frack-Free Balcombe Residents Association and West Sussex County Council case in 2014. So this was a judicial review that the council planning officer had wrongly advised the council committee that a fracking company, Quadrilla, had a history of breaching its planning conditions. that the council planning officer said that this was irrelevant, and it was also said that public objections to the fracking were irrelevant. So the judicial review was claiming that this should have been taken into account by the council's committee that decided whether or not to allow the fracking to go ahead. Justice Gilbert dismisses the judicial review and also suggests that it would be unlawful if the council did take into account the massive public protests that there were against fracking. That would be an irrelevant consideration. And of course, councils have a duty to take into account relevant considerations and ignore irrelevant considerations. So, just it's an illustration of how the courts weren't always very sympathetic to litigation to try and prevent fracking. But really this was something that was resolved at the ballot box, as I said, in the 2019 general election. Then we've got licensing for coal, and also you can see a trend. This has stopped since 2024. There was a bit of a wobble after the Conservative government said that it was banning fracking and making a lot of sort of good noises about reduction of fossil fuels. Unbelievably, a new coal mine was approved in 2019 at Whitehaven in Cumbria. But that turned out to be the last ever coal permit that was ever approved, and the permit itself was quashed in a case that came out 5 years later in 2024. Friends of the Earth brought a challenge against the Minister for Levelling Up Housing and Communities. And their challenge was based on the reasoning, or similar to the reasoning in Finch, that the Minister hadn't properly taken into account the Scope 3 emissions that would result, not all of the emissions that would result from burning coal if you mined coal in Cumbria. So that was the last coal mine. There was another coal mine permit, the last coal mine permit that expired in 2023 in Wales, and the Labour government from 2024 said that it was going to halt coal mining approvals, and it's also pledged to specifically amend the Coal Industry Act 1994 to say that no new coal will be allowed, so that that's in primary legislation and can't easily be changed, well, without Parliament. Unfortunately, though, there is a bit of a checkered history in the courts. Courts were sometimes seen to be as much pro-coal as Justice Gilbert was in allowing fracking to go ahead. In H.J. Banks and Secretary of State for Housing in 2018, the Secretary of State refused permission for an open cast coal mine, and a challenge was brought by the coal company. Justice Ousley said that the Secretary of State was wrong to refuse permission for the coal mine because apparently they failed to set out their reasoning for why refusal should take place in two proper stages, and particularly they hadn't given adequate reasons about why renewable energy could fulfill the energy needs that the coal that you didn't have would leave. And this is, a really bizarre decision of a judge that, frankly is just completely out of touch with climate reality, because the answer is that even in 2018 it was clear, and it's even more clear now, that coal is much, much more costly, both in an environmental sense but also in a purely monetary sense, compared to renewable energy. Solar, wind and battery utility scale batteries are now much cheaper than coal will ever be. And I think it's just worth noting that fossil fuel costs are really sort of flatlining. They're not going up or down very much, and haven't for quite a long time. While renewable energy, we'll talk about more of this next week, renewable energy costs are declining logarithmically, like Moore's law. So renewables are getting cheaper, batteries are getting cheaper, coal and gas are getting the same, prices staying the same, are more expensive. And, these sort of fundamental things, facts, what judges like Justice Ousley didn't seem to appreciate. The process for extraction of coal was that you had to buy the land, you had to secure council planning permission, you had to get a license from the coal authority, you needed an environmental impact assessment if you were doing an open cast mine, you need a special license for water extraction from the water regulators, and you need to notify UK Research and Innovation, the university regulator, for boreholes that were more than 30 metres, a bit more, 100 feet deep, because of the research, potential research implications. But all of that hopefully is moot because we're not going to have any more coal. Interestingly, there is a special provision in the Coal Industry Act 1994 that said if you've got an open cast mine, you've got a duty to restore the land, which also bound the liquidators of insolvent companies. So, to make sure that you don't have a coal company leaving, going bust and then hiding behind limited liability, and leaving a scorched earth landscape behind after they've extracted all the valuable minerals and made a lot of profit. Okay, so now we go on to decommissioning. Although I should probably just add before we do that although North Sea oil is going, coal is gone, fracking is gone, this just really makes us focus on global production of fossil fuels. So we've got our rules in the UK, and great that all the fossil fuels are being ceased now in the UK, but we've really got to look at the oil majors, BP, Shell, Glencore, around the world, because that's 13 times the entire emissions, remember, of the United Kingdom. But now to decommissioning. This is a topic mainly because in 1995 Greenpeace activists occupied the Brent Spar oil rig off the coast of the UK in the North Sea after Shell had proposed releasing it out to sea. So the activists at the time were very concerned that it would be bad to just dump or release oil rigs out to sea. It caused a big fuss, as you can imagine. And there was a legislative response to prevent oil rigs being released. And this is a really big issue, and thinking on it has changed significantly. And it matters because there's around 470 oil rigs, oil platforms, and 5,000 oil wells in the United Kingdom. Look at the North Sea in total, around Norway and so on. There's 1,500 oil rigs, and worldwide there's 12,000 oil rig platforms, many nearing an end to their life. So the Petroleum Act 1998 at the moment in section 28A says it's an offence to abandon an offshore installation or a submarine pipeline. Section 29 says that Secretary of State can give notice to prepare an abandonment programme. Sections 33 to 37 says that Secretary of State can write, revise or impose a programme on a company or anyone owning an interest in it. And so, like the coal provisions that we've just mentioned about abandoning an open cast mine, this cuts through the corporate veil and targets shareholders. So, very, very strong provisions. And in 2019, the Oil and Gas Authority, now the NSTA, projected that £15.2 billion would need to be spent or would be spent on decommissioning projects over 10 years. So it's a huge amount of work. The engineering task is pretty big, very expensive. But funnily enough, environmental thinking has completely changed on this. So, there's plenty of literature now which shows that maybe it's actually better to just leave an oil rig exactly where it is. Maybe you want to take away at the top of the oil rig so you can recycle all the steel because there's a huge amount of steel. But for the marine environment, actually ripping an oil rig out of the ground could be very disruptive because if you have an oil rig that's been there for 18, 20 years, whatever its production period was, then life is, despite the initial disruption, going to attach itself and build reefs and habitats for the sea life underneath the water. So it could be much, much better to leave oil rigs exactly where they are. And also, if we think about the enormous price tag for decommissioning oil rigs, and also just don't be naive. The price tag which oil companies attach to decommissioning is probably going to be a bit inflated. Then we just ask very simply, wouldn't that money be better spent not by ripping oil rigs out and decommissioning them according to the current legislation, but leaving them there and putting that money into renewable energy until we at least get to net zero? Okay, so that's the state of the debate on decommissioning at the moment. And finally, I want to look at winding up in the public interest. And this is a provision that applies for all companies, but I think in the case of oil and gas companies, it's important to highlight this because the oil company business model is to profit despite the damage to the climate. Under the Insolvency Act, Section 124A, the Secretary of State can petition the court or a court if it appears to be expedient in the public interest that a company should be wound up, and if the court thinks it's just and equitable to do so. It can't do this, just out of the blue. It follows from a company investigation, as spelt out in Section 124A(1)(a). And an investigation can be appointed by a Secretary of State on application of 200 or more members of a company. And so in the case of BP, Shell, Glencore, that's usually going to be, it's invariably going to be their shareholders. If they have a good reason for investigation and they give just £5,000 in security. And these rules are set out in a different act, the Companies Act 1985, Section 431. So that's one way that you can get into an investigation. 200 shareholders. A second way that you can get into an investigation is that if a court directs it, and a third way is that the Secretary of State can themselves begin an investigation, and they've got a structured statutory discretion about when that can be. For our purposes, this can be if a company's affairs are being conducted for a fraudulent or unlawful purpose. C, if managers of the company are guilty of fraud, misconduct towards its members. Or D, if not all information that should be going is going to members as they might reasonably expect. What I just want to focus on is you can start an investigation, on the Secretary of State can, if a company appears to be conducted for an unlawful purpose or a fraudulent purpose, but the baseline is an unlawful purpose. Okay, so just to recap, courts can wind up companies in the public interest if it's just and equitable to do so, and you can get to court to ask for that to happen if you've had a company investigation. And so the main thing for our purposes is you could do it with 200 shareholders, or a Secretary of State could do it. A little bit more investigation about investigations. An investigation could also follow on a report under the Financial Services and Markets Act on money laundering or terrorist finance, from fraud investigations from the Serious Fraud Office, or to get information to assist overseas regulators. And according to Palmer's company law, if a Secretary of State refuses to appoint an investigation, if they've been asked by members, a member of a company can apply to the court for an order anyway for the court to start the investigation. And then the investigator, the inspector, would have to do a public report. So this could be a very powerful way in order to take companies into public control. A winding up procedure could be any form of administrative procedure. It could result in a number of different consequences. It could result in transition of the company to a new entity that was publicly controlled. It could result in the company being liquidated. But most importantly, it would put the company that was under investigation and then was put into a winding up procedure under the Secretary of State's control. And it hasn't been used yet for fraud or for unlawful purposes relating to climate damage at all. Namely, companies that have been used, or for instance, companies that have been run that have the purpose an unlawful purpose of violating, for example, the Paris Agreement. This is a law, it's an international law that binds every state. We've got an obligation to get to 2 degrees. This is operationalized, as we've seen, through the European Convention, the Human Rights Act. There is a need to decrease emissions in accordance with nationally determined contributions. And so, very simply, the argument could be made that if you've got oil companies, gas companies, coal companies that have a purpose of violating the Paris Agreement, therefore, by extension, violating the obligations under the Human Rights Act, then that is a very good premise or a very good ground to start thinking about company investigations and winding up. And at the moment, this is important because the government does not have any plan at all to deal with British Petroleum, to deal with Shell, to deal with Glencore, to deal with the other major oil polluters. And might think, well, unlawful purpose, fraudulent purpose, this is language which is pretty strong, but there's very, very good evidence of fraud and unlawful intent by oil companies and their executives. So we just have to look at the news in the last 5 or 10 years, and there's a constant stream of reports. BP, Shell, Exxon in the news story there from Euronews. Seized emails reveal deceptive climate tactics and greenwashing. You've got a whistleblower from Shell, a Shell consultant, quits and accuses the firm of extreme harms. Greenwashing, fraudulent intent, it has been part and parcel of the oil business, in particular deceiving the public about the extent of climate damage. When oil companies knew from their own internal research that climate change was occurring, they actively tried to cover it up and funded research in order to try and deceive the public. We can look to good models. If you put BP and Shell under government supervision, there are good models about how you can transition these companies into renewable energy companies. BP and Shell are massive corporations. They've got global reach. They're a very important part of the energy system, and they've got quite a lot of investment in renewable energy already. The problem is that their incentives to make profit for their shareholders run contrary to their investment in renewable energies, because the oil business is still so profitable when you've got short-term oil price volatility. But a good model about how to transition away is Ørsted. Ørsted was a state-owned oil and gas company, used to be called Dong Energy, and before 2009, 85% of its revenue was from coal, oil and gas production. But then, in 2009, the government did a public offering. It sold off a minority stake in the shares, but still kept a majority stake. And it set a new target of making Dong Energy get to 85% renewable energy by 2040. I beg your pardon, it was in 2014 that it sold off a minority stake to fund investment in offshore wind. In 2017, it changed its name to Ørsted, which it is now, and it sold off parts of its oil and gas business. And by 2019, it had already achieved its objective, that's in 10 years, of becoming a 85% renewable energy company, 21 years ahead of schedule. It is now the world's largest offshore wind producer. It builds a lot of the wind turbines that are around Britain, and it is doing very well because of it, because the state had the foresight to see that something needs to be done with oil and gas companies. They need to transition. And we could tell similar stories about Vattenfall in Sweden and Enel in Italy that have undergone similar changes. And really, there's no reason why BP, Shell, Glencore could not be next. Finally, we come to a couple of rights, and it's a bit paradoxical to talk about rights in oil, coal and gas companies because they are so fundamentally destructive. But what we're going to do instead is just look at a couple of things that are tangentially related on clean energy and the rights that the public get through tax, or whether they actually subsidise oil and gas companies. Okay, so first of all, could there be a right to clean energy? There's not one clearly in law at the moment in the UK. But we know that under international law, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and Economic and Social Rights say that there's this right of all peoples to enjoy and utilise freely natural wealth and resources. And previously, as I said at the start, this might have been thought to refer to the right to exploit coal, oil and gas and mine minerals. But it's very clear today that this conflicts with everyone's right to natural wealth and resources in clean air, in a stable climate, and seas that don't rise. We also know that Article 27 of the Universal Declaration says that there's a right to benefit the benefits of scientific progress, and UNESCO says that this is inextricably linked to the right to a clean environment and sustainable development. So it entails a positive duty on the state to promote the spread of technology once we've got it, and that clearly applies to the spread of clean renewable energy as much as it did the polio vaccine or rural electrification in New Deal America in the 1930s. Now, this is important because, it's not just nice to look at international law, but in the Klimasinjurinnen judgment from the European Court of Human Rights, it was recognised, as we've seen, there's a duty to halt emissions and reduce emissions according to nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement and the UN Framework on Climate Change as part of the right to life in Article 2. And also Article 8. And there's no reason, if we're interpreting the European Convention in accordance with international law in this way, that it shouldn't incorporate also the duty on governments to transition to clean energy, both to protect people's natural resources in clean air, in a stable climate, and to spread the benefits of science. In other words, deploy clean technology. There should be a positive duty on the state, not just to reduce emissions negatively, but on the positive side, increase the spread of clean technology. And we can get to this without human rights or without relying on human rights just by looking to what Australia has done. So the Australian Energy Regulator has just in the last year said that Australian energy companies have to offer everyone a contract or a tariff that allows or provides for 3 hours of free electricity every day, because solar power is so abundant that in the peaks during the day there's so much solar that the grid has to switch off supply. So the regulator has just said, well, people ought to get free energy, or at least the Labour government behind the regulator has rolled this out. And there's absolutely no reason why we won't see this everywhere around the world. As more solar panels get built, more wind turbines get built, renewable energy is going to become very abundant very quickly. And that means when you've got zero marginal cost for extra production of renewables, we could be seeing something similar very soon right around the world. Then we've got the topic of taxes or subsidies, which I think is worth touching on briefly. So the Oil Taxation Act, Section 1, had originally a very significant petroleum revenue tax, but since 2016 it's effectively become 0% when before it was 75% of tax on oil company revenues. In fact, since 1987, companies have been getting relief from taxes for building oil platforms. And we can go through the other taxes, the ring-fenced corporation tax, in the Corporation Tax Act, the supplementary charge, 10% of profits. Taxes on oil have been going down and down and down and down, and really they've turned in the tax system, which once delivered more revenue from oil, has been transformed into subsidizing oil companies. And you can see that in the chart on the right-hand side. If you contrast what the UK has done to what Norway has done, well, it couldn't be more different. Norway, after the discovery of North Sea oil, put profits from the oil industry into a national fund, which is known as the Government Pension Fund Global of Norway. It's where all the oil money has gone, and it's got around $2 trillion in assets in 2025. The UK allowed all the North Sea oil money to just go to private companies like BP and Shell, and there is really nothing left. So, the idea that, well, when you discover resources, even if you're in a relatively stable democracy like the UK, that it's going to be a good thing for the public is just not accurate. I mean, it's Norway is exceptional. There aren't too many countries that have done nearly that well. The Alaska Permanent Fund is another example of good use of oil revenue. But of course, the public, the bottom line is that the public doesn't benefit from all the oil money as much as people might initially think. Okay, and so given that it doesn't really benefit anybody fiscally, and there is so much damage that has been caused, we can sum up a few different reform options, and I've got 6 for you. The first is that if we want to fulfill human rights and have a livable planet, then an easy first step that we could take is to change the duty of the North Sea Transition Authority explicitly to phase out fossil fuel extraction and not to maximise the economic recovery of oil as it currently says. Now, North Sea Transition Authority has stopped new oil and gas licences, but there is no duty yet to phase down the oil and gas licenses that still exist. The current government has said that it's not going to interfere with those contracts, but why not? If that is, if the continued extraction of oil and gas is contributing to or exacerbating climate damage, then absolutely there is a good case for stopping the production of oil. And you can compensate the oil companies at fair value, which if you take into account the externalities that they're currently not paying for or the pollution, fair value compensation would probably be close to zero. Second, you could enact a duty explicitly on the Coal Authority to cease all coal extraction. Government is committed to something like that in the Coal Industry Act. And it would be worth adding, like the North Sea Transition Authority is doing licensing rounds for carbon capture and storage, to explicitly give the Coal Authority a role in converting disused coal mines for energy storage and heat. Third, use the powers that we've got in the Insolvency Act to transition BP, Shell, Glencore to clean energy companies, using the petition for winding up in the public interest to adopt a model like Ørsted. Now, of course, this could be done in an act of parliament, a fresh act of parliament, but there's no reason why existing legislation can't be used in order to do it much more quickly. So remember, the Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change, or Net Zero, as I think the Energy Secretary, I forget what the title is now called, has the power to initiate this. So currently that's Ed Miliband. But you can also have 200 shareholders in BP, Shell or Glencore that could trigger the process. And then really it's up to court litigation. And so I think that's something that is definitely worth looking at, because there's got to be a plan to force BP and Shell and Glencore to stop the oil damage and gas damage and the coal damage that they are causing. Fourth, make companies liable for climate damage in a statutory tort where significant fossil fuel emissions contribute to global warming, and this contributes to loss or injury. So we've got the cases like Smith and Fonterra, we've got Klimazinjeringen in the European Court of Human Rights, we've got Liua and RWE, but particularly the court cases have not worked yet, and they could be sped up a great deal if there was an explicit codification of a statutory tort for climate damage. We could put it in the Clean Air Act 1993, Section 3A. Fifth, make companies and, more importantly, their executives personally liable for criminal damage if they release greenhouse gas emissions intentionally to make a profit and it contributes to injury or loss of property. And I think, obviously, just consider it for a moment, this is what most oil executives are doing. They know that their business model is damaging the climate. They know that this is going to cause wildfires, floods, property damage, loss of life, yet they continue to do it anyway to make a profit. And so the appropriate way to deal with this activity, which is intentional harm, is to criminalise it. Under the Criminal Damage Act 1971, you can add an explicit provision, Section 1A. And finally, because we're talking about unlawful activity or quasi-unlawful activity already, there's a very good case for changing the way that GDP statistics are done. So if you have BP, Shell, Glencore making profit from extracting oil, burning it, polluting the environment, this will still be counted under the Treasury's practice, and also in EU law under the gross national income regulations still count as lawful profits, which have to be counted and therefore raise GDP statistics, even though it is fundamentally damaging not only to the environment but also to the economy. And as I say, it's quasi-unlawful already because oil and gas extraction, which goes or runs against the Paris Agreement, is unlawful. It, however, is not properly made illegal in domestic law. So to implement international law properly, one of the steps that you could do, and also change the way that countries think about this, is amend the rules on GDP accounting. And this would also affect the Bank of England's use of monetary policy, so that assets weren't bought up, for instance, by the Bank of England in quantitative easing programs that came from oil and gas companies, and that it would take into account or wouldn't take into account oil and gas company growth when it was doing monetary policy to achieve government objectives for growth. Okay, so those are some reform options and how we can deal with fossil fuels in order to have a living planet in future.